Y gracias,
Bueno,
Plaqueta.
muy bien, que quede todo muy bonito. Muchas gracias por aceptar la invitación y por estar aquí.
Un gusto, gracias.
Hola, ¿cómo estás? Me imagino.
Ok. Hola otra vez a quienes están en este evento desde el principio y hola a quienes acaban de conectar. Yo soy Plaqueta y seguimos en este evento de conversaciones urgentes en el Día de la Tierra. Esta es una tarde de intercambio de ideas que existe gracias a la invitación de What Design Can Do, al apoyo de Fundación Ford para desarrollar estos eventos y a la colaboración de If Not Us, Then Who y la Alianza Mesoamericana de Pueblos y Bosques. Muchísimas gracias a las y los organizadores. Hace rato tuvimos un panel sobre descolonización del diseño y la sustentabilidad. Por si no lo vieron, les cuento que rapidísimo, ahí aprendimos un poco sobre el trabajo de asociaciones y cooperativas que aplican conocimientos ancestrales y la cosmovisión indígena para diversos trabajos. Y estos trabajos son respetuosos con el medio ambiente y algo muy importante es que el beneficio personal también es comunitario y para el planeta. Por si lo pueden ver después, si se lo perdieron, háganlo, estuvo buenísimo. Y ahora vamos a ir con otro panel, con otra conversación urgente, que es sobre apropiación cultural en las industrias creativas. Un tema candente, polémico, se va a poner bueno, pero antes vamos a ver un cortometraje. El cortometraje se llama Identidad y es del joven cineasta en Verá, Iván Jaripio, y es una metáfora audiovisual sobre la pérdida de tradiciones en los pueblos indígenas. Entonces vamos a verlo y ahorita regresamos con el panel.
Si logro entrar, Plaqueta, Yásnaya, ya la estás viendo. Espero que está bien internet. ¿Yásnaya nos escucha?
Sí los escucho. Hola, perdón, pero las cosas cosas malas de vivir en México me traen
Y bueno, el video, yo creo que le quedan 2 minutos más y ya regresaríamos con todos ustedes a poco. Sí, todos ustedes van a estar a poco en la próxima toma de este video.
Plaqueta, ¿podrías mencionar ahorita videos por parte de Ignoros en Luz, por favor? les digo, los van a estar doblando al inglés, por favor hablen despacio y claro.
Esto fue Identidad de Iván Jaripio. Muchas gracias a Ignoros Denhu por este video. Y ahora sí, vamos con el panel. Apropiación cultural. Es una expresión que escuchamos mucho cada vez más en redes, por ahí está muy relacionada con la cultura de la cancelación, pero a ver. Por un lado, hay muchísimo que aprender de las prácticas de diseño de las comunidades indígenas, pero hay una delgada línea entre inspiración y aprendizaje y apropiación y extractivismo cultural. Entonces, hay que preguntarnos y cuestionarnos, ¿cómo puede la comunidad internacional hacer un intercambio justo de conocimientos y a la vez asegurarse de que haya un reconocimiento y una retribución a las personas que participaron en estos proyectos? También, ¿qué prácticas se pueden adoptar entre las personas creativas blancas y blancomestizas y de las ciudades para garantizar que estos intercambios protejan y beneficien a las comunidades indígenas y no todo lo contrario? De eso vamos a hablar y otros temas que surjan. Les recordamos a todas las personas que están en el público, en la audiencia.
We remind the audience and the public that doesn't matter the platform where you are, please let us know your questions and your comments for us to share with the panelists, to whom I'm going to present. Today we have David Hernández Palmar, which is a filmmaker, and Yásnaya Aguilar, which is a linguist, author, and an activist, and also Guillermo Jester, which is a fashion designer. And I'm going to start with a question from Yásnaya. If you can please explain us, what is the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation, or the cultural exchange, to have a horizontal and fair exchange in cultures, and when does the problem start? Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for this opportunity of talking about these topics. Bueno, the matter with the culture and the cultures of the world, they think about them like little boxes, like with little borders, like with walls. So there is some interchange between these or among these boxes. But it's very difficult to create these exchanges. So it's not like you can say to someone, hey, can you please stop making these thoughts with elements from Europe or here or there. The cultural interchange has been very intense with our communities. The problem is that I prefer to call, like, well, as it came in, more than that term, I would like to call the unfair cultural appropriation. That is when a structure, a person, an organization has a lot of privilege, and then on the other hand, there is another part that is very suppressed and repressed. So while you are repressing it, you are taking another cultural elements from another culture to reinforce them in these new ones. So this is in reality that what we need. This is the symmetry between these elements for them to count as a fair cultural appropriation. The last time I saw these Converse tennis shoes with some like patterns, some patterns from the indigenous communities, and then they are appropriating these cultural elements from the Western, and then there's been a lot of images from people and from women wearing saris, which is the traditional outfits in India, and you see them in t-shirts. And I don't want to come up with racism and discrimination when I say this, like, oh, a lot of people say this, oh, I like this, and they take it and they making them or like ours in their culture. And we need that symmetry in the culture, so we have a very fair exchange between these cultures. And in the USA, it's a country where they talk about this a lot, and they have a lot of particular types of people, and they have a lot of ethnicities, where you can check this as boxes. Like, for example, these feather arrangements on their heads, they appropriate these arrangements of feathers, and they appropriate these elements in a not very way. And in Mexico, they have been talking about this a lot. And in Mexico, the most or the biggest unfair cultural appropriator has been the government. The coat and arms of our flag, they are appropriating these coats of arms from our flag, and they're not taking into consideration the indigenous elements to incorporate it on these symbols. And we are going to talk about more than all these things that you talk about, but I would like to go to Guillermo and talk about how he uses these visual resources to propose like a better world. And I know, in a more fair world. And I know it sounds very romantic, but I think it is important to talk about these topics, and also like extractivism as cultural appropriation. David, you are on mute. Hi, everybody. This is David Hernández Palmar. Thank you so much for the space. I'm going to say hi to everybody without the mask briefly, just to say good hi, but I'm going to put it on so I can comply. First, we need to recognize that the narration and the necessity of communicating ourselves is something that it's implicit in ourselves. And we need to incorporate this in our structure as a right. In these things, talking about rights, what is a fair world? What Yásnaya said about symmetry and how this is polarized to tell stories, to make movies, to write scripts, to tell stories. It turns out that the stories that we can incorporate in this systematically, that they have been out of the narrative, and the more we approach these narratives to our daily lives, that they are involved in these stories. And sometimes about these stories, we don't know about if the person in the story fell in love or not, if these people or this person lost the territory and if he got it back, or if a plant disappeared and that's why they cannot even name it again. So I think that in that proportion, for us to say we are here alive, we need to tell the stories. This is good because a lot of people make a living out of telling stories, and they have realized that there is a myth. The indigenous cinema is not like a thing that you can put in a box shoes. It's not a category that you can change in context, in language, in configuration of depending on the point of view. For example, in USA, they have indigenous people, and they do blood tests for them to know. They have to know what is the percentage of your ancestors and your level of ethnicity, and they can tell you are this percent and this percent of ethnicity. And we can apply this to the Latin American context about this mixing of the cultures that in our case it has caused some damage. Some people feel that with the right of telling the stories as indigenous, and with this background, in this, I can take it and I can take this in a field that we haven't really solved, and I can participate on this in different spaces. But be careful, Mexico is another reference about the pioneer sisters of the Pueblo Ixtop in the years 1985 in being the first registered women to be able to do cinema. 36 years after, in 2021, we're still discussing the technology about what in the past was a prediction about the climate change. So I believe that the thirst of life that the communities and the people have, it is spiritual too. As long as our imagination doesn't die, and we can express this with our own language, we can express that in that dimension, we can build these metaphors. And besides that, give the opportunity in other moments to feel that we have to be the center of these narratives. So I feel like this here, as a person or as a collective particular thing, I can assume that the cinema and the narrative and the fact that telling stories, it's a right. It's a right for everybody to ask ourselves, when was this camera on the October the 12th? And if we ask ourselves that, is this the story is not the story that it's in a public place, is the story that it's in the forest, in the communities, in the rainforest, in the people. So there is a topic that there is something dynamic, and they're always trying to recreate these metaphors. And I think this is the richness on this. Maybe we're not very conscious about this and how and why we want to make justice, but since there is a very systematic injustice, a lot of our narratives are going to being trying to criticize the systems, and we can make like a novel, and I don't know, I can make a fiction, or I can make an animated film. And I think that there is like a privilege, not because the topics of accessing, but our grandparents fought so much for us to say, for us to be able to say what we're saying right now. And I think this is what makes me happy, and what makes me keep doing and making my contribution on this. Thank you so much, David. We are going to talk about more about the things that you tell us, but now we're going to go to Guillermo so he can tell us about his work process and all the collaborations that he does with artisans, and what strategies do you apply to ensure yourself that this model of business is fair and it doesn't delete the work of other people. Hi, everybody. Hi, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here in this panel. There is going to be a very interesting conversation. I'm going to present a little bit about my work. I have a brand of clothes that I also work in a nonprofit organization collaborating with indigenous from Chiapas and Yucatan, but especially now I'm going to present a little bit about my brand and the 4 pillars of my brand. The main thing is that we do annual collections, and everybody knows that the fashion industries are the most the ones that more pollute, and that's why we want to contribute against this. And I think like all the brands of fashion, they should start doing this, because this consumption, we know control also produces And we're also collaborating in different brands, horizontally and vertically. Inside of this process of this collection, I think it is essential, this part of research and to contextualize with all the people that you are collaborating with this collection. We're always looking for, if you can make the screen bigger, I'm so sorry, just like the way that we used to use Windows, because it looks like cut out. I think it looks better like this. Can you make it full screen, or I don't know, how can you do it? You cannot see it well, right? It looks better because it used to look like cut out. Yeah, you can just leave it like that. I'm sorry for the interruption.
Well, as part of this collection, the issues we have in each visit to the communities, the different communities, to the groups we collaborate with. In the selection of the issue, of the topic, we inspired in the last connection in the seats. Many times it's not available information in internet or in books, but it is information that we obtain directly through the conversation that we generate with the artisans, talking to the grandmas and stories and legends and how they represent these elements in their traditional iconography. And from then, we learn all the concepts and also experiment with the traditional techniques. And at the end, we elaborate the final designs. So in this process, is very important to get some pictures, to record videos, to show all this process, to be able to communicate this process to other people and have the transparency about the collaborations, from labels with the name of the artisan that made each piece, to the origin, the amount, to get the people to get to know from pictures and videos the artisans that are behind all these processes. As part of the pillar of circular fashion, we create clothes that are not disposable using zero waste methodology through traditional indigenous patterns and applying sustainable process. The traditional outfit in indigenous, they make these pieces and they have no waste, and these are the clothes they use every day. And with this same methodology, we use this technique of zero waste. Another element of this brand is that it's genderless, and it goes beyond to do neutral designs. We look for breaking with this traditional aesthetics, and we look for go through feminine and masculine aesthetics or fashion, because for us, fashion is the way to express our individuality through our outfit. And the most important is the cultural identity. What I was saying is that, well, we were talking about a small pieces for each collection, and the artisans are part of this process and research and information, and we look for get to the transparency in all the processes with the artisans and also with the buyer, with the final consumer. And I think, well, this is the presentation of my brand, but we will talk about all these issues right now. Thank you very much. I would like to know the opinion of Yásnaya and David about this kind of collaborations among white designers, maybe with a more hegemonic formation, but that decided to collaborate with artisans. What should they look for to have a fair collaboration? Well, to be really fair, we should have a world without colonialism and capitalism. All cancelled. It's very difficult because it's not a personal issue. It's not against certain designers, but there is a question from the beginning that we need to ask. We are asking to which designers that I are trying to have a fair relationship with that people, that we never ask to the communities how do they would like to collaborate with. Why not? The commercialization also comes from indigenous people, because if only white people make the commercial part, the marketing, if we have the artisans that are collaborating with the brand, but not the artisan making the promotion and the commercialization of their handicrafts, their materials. There is a very important thing behind, studied by Tajodias. She used a term or a concept. For example, the traditional outfit of my community belongs to no one, is not registered as a brand, you know, because no one can register it. And when you see that other traditional, one traditional outfit make a small difference, but the property is from the community. In Occident, it is all about individual property. So in the moment that you're creating a brand, even when you're collaborating with the artisans, the brand is registered and it has an individual property. It belongs to one person or company. So it goes to the logic of the individual. And so it goes from a community property to an individual property. And that's truly a problem, because many artisans would like to collaborate, because the asymmetry make that the people that can do the commercialization are white privileged people. So my question is that collaboration is needed? That's my personal question. That are the questions that will be in the final board of this conversation to continue thinking and discussing forever. It is very complex and complicated, because you can think that maybe they can get some economic benefits, but will be an economic benefit that is immersed in these discrepancies, and it depends not from the creator of the branding or the artisan, but it depends on the person that has the register of the private property. So you are making an issue of private property, a thing that is community property. David? Well, I would like to also talking in this in many conversations when we participated, they start with the inclusion and word and are complicated with the collaboration word. Inclusion happens because it happened and exclusion before. So I'm including you, but they are still my rules, the rules of the excluder. So it's not, I want to reinforce that it's not about the person, but it's about the system that is operating. In the case of filmmaking and music, I think that it is also because there is a systematic unfairly in our territory, and some singers and designers, in the moment that they have common sense, they capitalize their careers with indigenous sounds or Afro sounds and music, and they remain silent when the communities are affected by repression, by starving. So that's the moment when you think that if you took food to your table using elements from a culture, and if you don't have a political position to be solidary with the community where you take things to use in your production, well, I see that too in books when they talk about indigenous languages. Well, actually, we indigenous need to speak 4 or 5 languages just to understand all people and to interpret. So, besides talking all these languages, we are being underestimated despite our huge capacity of translation, mediation, and having patience to whom speak different languages. So I think that we need to look at 20 years before, when the practices of fashion and to having a different view of the value. But today there are people that have the possibility of having these roles of exchange and the capitalist system with the smaller impact possible, but then with these conversations we can recognize where we are stand, and if at one moment we need to be aside to let the people that need to communicate or that is able to do the things to act, if we need to let ourselves aside, it's our opportunity. One person that shared with indigenous communities years ago, well, that person maybe has the sensibility to make honor to the word and to the community. When you see how this person use the elements of the culture just to improve or mask the contribution. So to what point we can talk about the fair collaboration? Have in mind that when I was small, I thought that collaborate is to do something without money involved. Because that's why I'm collaborating, because if there's money, I'm selling or I'm buying. Well, I don't want to talk about language or Spanish, but I think that in the practice, there are different ways to live culture, but without being detrimental or without trying to represent, but more with a sincere dialogue and discussion to think, where are we going? We need to walk together. Yeah, I could think on when we received books in Spanish and some words were in our own language, but actually the education was all immersed for us indigenous, but the rest of the society cannot refer to an indigenous designer or an indigenous filmmaker, not only the name, but also the work. I think that in this system of recognizing the way the knowledge is built, when we start recognizing this, I think we can have a more horizontal dialogue, a more fair dialogue. But I think that today these are the ways we need to walk, and they are spiny ways. I can assume this with all the appreciation and value, and I can value this because we are not talking about individuality, but we are talking about community spaces. I think we are talking about also, we come from a process of starting to learn how to move like in community. This is how I could put this. No, thanks Plaqueta, thanks to you. I would like to recall the thing that you said about textbooks, school books, and the shields in the flags, because I think we focus a lot on cultural appropriation of individuals or brands or cases that become very polemical. And anytime that there is a fashion and someone using a feather headset and someone that is making tattoos that is using community themes, but what the states are doing to promote the cultural appropriations. How do you see that? Who would like to start? Well, as I'm obsessed in the state. I wouldn't like to start, but I think that is different in each case. It depends on the internal classification of people. In some countries, the differences among indigenous and white is much more clear, but here to build the identity, the national identity of the Mexican state, it was built on the idea of mixing races. So it's very difficult to talk about cultural appropriation because maybe my grandpa was indigenous. So how appropriation if it are my roots? So it's mine too. So it was allowed because the active nationalist project, I see that in the United States, the flag has not indigenous elements in the flag, but the Mexican state is very appropriative and it is hidden because it's national, it's in our flag. In the 30s happened something very interesting. The nationalist issue was so strong that they decided that Santa Claus was not able to bring presents, so Quetzalcoatl was taking the presents to kids. But it says that Quetzalcoatl, it's a snake with feathers, so that was not very attractive for childhood. So in the times, in the 30s, in a soccer field, I didn't work because it wasn't a very good idea because Quetzalcoatl was a snake. But this is the way also that it's happening today with some famous people dressed as Mexican, you know. And what? So you can think, what's Mexican in outfit? What's a Mexican outfit? So it's very strong in identity, but with the food, with the cultural, they don't distinguish among different kinds of clothes like huipil and bursa. So they think that's Mexican, so I can use whatever from each indigenous people because it's Mexican. And that was imposed in Oaxaca. It didn't happen. It is a state element of property or properties of element of music. So the state made things very violent with indigenous peoples, forbidding languages, and but at the same time they take these indigenous elements to build the speech of what is being Mexican. It doesn't matter which community, but people, it is very sad because what is indigenous is like a conglomerate. It is irrelevant. So Maria,
And Maria Felix can wear like a blouse of, and it doesn't matter because if she wears like an indigenous outfit, it doesn't matter because it's Maria Felix, right? And this matters a lot. And the indigenous people, we know this. So for example, for the Day of the Mules, we need to dress like indigenous people. And of course, this comes from our culture. At the same time that the state, the government is doing this, they're using us as their roots, as their political and cultural roots. And that's why I insist we're not the ones to blame for this, that they try to use their roots, and that's the official speech. That the state gets excited and they also take these elements from the culture and make them like folklore and folk, like the outfits that the athletes are gonna wear for the Olympics. They have this indigenous embroidery, and this is the part that we can take advantage more, and that's how we appropriate and we celebrate it. How do you see it, David? The one that unmute himself, that's the one who shares the point of view. Well, I think that to begin with, we have to put in context for being a work a little bit overwhelming, but it's necessary to give proportion to all these things that collectively understand what they are. I don't know, because within this public consensus, since the capitals, from the capitals, what they understand what indigenous is. But what is indigenous? In my case, what is Awayu? Or what do you need to become a Awayu? Beyond that, of course, our culture, to become a Awayu, you have to have your ancestors and from your mom's side, and you have to relate to that. That comes to my mind, for example, the state and its role. But it also happens that there is a case of a friend in common with me and Yásnaya, that he wrote about the imagination that we have about the people of the north and the North Pole. And it happens that the country that is the most north, it's Greenland, where the majority of its population is indigenous. In terms of verifying the facts, because it comes out that Santa Claus and its origin and its practice, it comes from the Sami culture that is Scandinavian, that actually that's where the movie Frozen comes from. And they are inspired by this movie Frozen. And Santa Claus, he used to be very fun. It was a person that he used to take his chicha and he used to give gifts to the kids like a big uncle. And there was now a fight, but there was sometimes a little bit of like a dream, that dream it's from Sami, and those indigenous they brought it to Greenland, and they bring this concept to these industry of sodas, and they work with this Santa Claus icon. With this, without taking into consideration all these things that they have been appropriate, and they don't pay taxes. They don't pay taxes for the water and for the consumption of the water, and they don't even report the use of this water to the treasury. And still now, within this capitalist logistics, without them paying taxes, well, at least we have like a weekly use of water. But no, this is like a big example of, because I believe that there is a nationalist topic built from the movies and fabricated from the people. It's even told that the penguins are from the North Pole, when we know that the penguins come from the South, right? So I do believe that all of this that we have assumed from that we see visually, like I said, the depth that we have from the movies, from the people, it's keep giving orientation to these indigenous people to be updated, and not to say them this is the policy of truth, but also what they told you is not the truth. And I think like this is the way that we can contribute, and this is the contribution of the cinema. But also the big rulers, for saying like that, they have this logic from the movies, this revolution from for example, the Russian Revolution came from the from the cinema. And a lot of revolutions, they have this reference from the movies. And there's a clarity between who has the power from the cinema as a colonizing model from society. So I think that we feel there is a big responsibility, a historical responsibility, but the pretty part of this narration is that we can recreate it, enjoy it, and create it using our creativity. It is not a privilege, but it does cost a lot to raise awareness. That is something that comes with us as people. This is the moment where, boom, we realize this. So we begin to enjoy this effectively. To narrate is to live twice, just like that. Thank you so much. Now I would like to see the point of view of Guillermo as an independent creator. I would like to very quick talk about these comments that Yásnaya made about the collaborations, and totally I'm with her. It shouldn't be necessary. From my perspective as a designer, I think it will be a very interesting conversation that an artisan that is making collaborations can have this space to talk about this point of view. I can be talking about how am I working, but I feel like directly the artisans, it is a very rich experience. And another important topic is about to raise awareness about this privilege that we have, and sadly that it is related to education. And a lot of things happen that these collaborations that we can try to do with the craftswomen, with all around the world, is that the fact that having this privilege of access education and being able to study in a public or private university, but having a title that tells you you are a designer, and knowing that you have more knowledge, and when you arrive to this community and you arrive to this uh, attitude from colonialism, it's just this whipil is not pretty because it's not tied to the body, or maybe because the colors, they shouldn't be like that. And I feel like in being aware of these privileges and all these ideas, there's wrong ideas that we have, that they have been planted in us since we were kids. I think it is important that to achieve a more horizontal collaboration, and at the end, from my point of view, this is not charity, because charity is very vertical, since you're privileged to how you see everybody down, and that's why we should impulse and promote these dialogues, more horizontal. And about the question about the state, and that you were saying about education, about what is taught to us to make general these indigenous communities, that not even in schools, from elementary, from middle school, from high school, they're not teaching us all in each one of these communities and all this cultural identity. They, at the end, they make a generalization of all these communities and the population and how they live in a social structure, and they never go beyond that to talk about what they represent. And the state, for example, the transportation, how is it possible that buses, these soda buses from these international brands, they come and they get to the most isolated communities, but in these communities there are not transportation to move to another towns. Even the topic of trash, the garbage, in these communities they don't have a garbage truck that picks it up. So what they do is just burn all the garbage, and that includes plastic that generate toxic gases, and also this affects the communities, and the government that doesn't even take responsibility, and they don't see a sustainable way to help these communities. And for example, television is becoming a more important thing than clean water. And how is it possible that they have cable and internet and television, like cable, but in these communities, and they don't have clean water? I feel like there's a lot of things that we can still talk about. We don't have a lot of time, but just to close and to be very concise, I have another question about the state to just what should the state do besides that disappearing in? Should we come up with laws, or should we come up with different tools and resources to sound a little more academic from the oppressor? How can we work with this? Yeah, historically, the state has been protecting the private property and the market. In this sense, it's a little bit complicated, but we have the risk. There is very risky in a lot of aspects, like the wishes that we have, like the wishes of enjoying the collective property in these aesthetic manifestations. All these communities are in a collective matter, the same way as the soil and the land is from the community, and also the music, the way of dancing, the graphic patterns of the clothes, that's community. And that changes and evolves. It's not the same before than now. It takes more elements. And what is translated, we need to translate these wishes in the language of the rights, in the legal language. And from there's some problems. The first, who has? There is a big discussion about this that is done in Mexico and in Guatemala also, because in different cases, how can you have these discussion panels, and how can you get together all these communities, and how can you make that this doesn't stay still, that keeps changing, and that we appropriate more new elements? It's not going to be original, it's not going to be protected. So it's a tool, very sadly, when we have to defend our territory or whatever, we have to come up with an agreement, because it is different. This can be like a tool to take care of not losing that translation. And we need to regulate that. We need to have the right of consultation. We have to discuss this with the law. I think the point is about the free determination and autonomy, but the state, they prefer to take our rights before recognize them. So there's some conflict there. Excuse me? It could be a minor problem. Another problem that we need to talk about. Guillermo David, about this topic? Yes, of course. The state is going to decide if it's going to be something traditional or not from a community, because it is registered like the traditional iconography or the traditional costumes. I feel like the problem is rooted there. The main problem is like all the people that they don't matter, about this, and they think that the artisans they only do things by hand, but they don't see this as like ceremonial products, and they take for granted this art, and sadly they think that this is something cheap. It's very sad that they don't see, they cannot have more knowledge to know more about these topics. I feel like we also have this responsibility to research about this work, to avoid all these topics about cultural appropriation. It's also within us to demand to the state to know more about these roots in the community. David? Well, I will say that, like I said at the beginning, the thirst of living is making us look for more, search for more. Not everything is solved with policies. Like Yásnaya said, the fight we have to start it in a frame of laws. In this fight and this resilience from the indigenous people, for example, me, I have the life. We have learned also that there are moments where even learning how can generate within the system the same state, when we demonstrate in this system they were wrong, they look for technicisms like, well, yes and no. And they have, I feel like the whole time I insist on this, there is a necessity of not disappearing. It made us look and to search for more and the least bad option. And we're also trying to look for metaphors, to look for a sense in the daily life. There is a lot of people that admire the nations and the structures that they have. Some indigenous towns like in Canada, in the USA, like they supposedly have like a better treatment of these people. But it's the state who determines who is the member of that nation, so they can put some requirements. Or for example, in Australia, an indigenous people, they were claiming back a big territory from Australia. But it's the state who determines who is gonna be the leader of this community, and they can give the land to these people. There's always a crack in the system where you can see where you can see these failures, but we have to remember that the system is a system. And we have to link these cultures. And like always, like people, there is another way of creating life. I will look like that. I will look this problem from there. I have been able to participate in design and public policies, and it has to do with we are in an industry of laws. We're also working with the budget for them to make possible. We're also asking ourselves, what is the linking with this problem? And I feel like I will look at this as the state could have more willing in this, and that there is a system, and we have to insist as people, and we're gonna keep insisting.
How would you think we can start to sensibilize people that are not familiar with these issues? People that are not in academic circles, that are not in this panel or in specialized media. How can we take this discussion outside? I could say what Guillermo said. We need to ask ourselves to have dialogues in the daily basis and think on how we can do this. This is a way to start. It's not the solution, but it's a way to get to those solutions. That is what I would say. What else can you think of? Also thinking on the approach from design, using design tools or the tools that you use in your work and your communities and professions. I think that in the School of Design that is not very talked about these issues, but I think I would say that we should have panels like this because it's not an individual issue, but it's systemic. So we need to include creators of any kind. We need to continue talking and problematizing this, especially with people that are in design schools and fashion schools. I think this should be included in the curriculum. Guillermo, how do you live this in your hegemonic education? I agree totally with that. The people with that they say at school we only learn about fashion and about Europe and the United States and the more representative cities of fashion in the world, and practically we don't talk about at all about the communities that exist in Mexico, the indigenous communities, the traditional techniques, and we don't talk at all about this. And I think it's the most important to insist to get we as individuals to build ourselves in all these issues. And I would like to invite the people around us in our community to question themselves about all these issues. And I think that the design careers should be much more involved in all these processes and start to have in the curriculum these issues and stop being only in the surface. And what do you think is the role of the media? David, would you like to say something? I just like to say that in this pandemic time, we say that half of the solution against COVID is not being fair. I think that for these issues, the main thing is also not to be afraid to speak, to be honest, to be humble, to get to understand that it's not against one person or one practice. We need to identify the macro thing, the macro issue. Because I think that in the field, taking back the filmmaking issue, when we talk about quotation for indigenous people, and people get angry, and I would say, why you get angry? Because of this conversation, I'm not getting in your house to get your resources unless you come to our houses to get our culture, to make money with our culture, using our culture. This is a discussion I have with my colleagues, but I think the most important is not to be afraid to talk about it and not feel that it is a threat when someone who is indigenous would like to speak loud to make his voice or her voice heard. And what do you think are the role of the traditional and the new media without falling in the white perspective or talking about fair commerce, how we can go deeper in this issue? You know, I will do the wrong word, but how to be inclusive. Well, when we talk about media, we talk about many things: community radios, community television, community filmmaking, indigenous filmmaking. We have someone here very important with a long history. There are a lot of things happening and a lot of indigenous women that are filmmakers. I think that the issue is that we are not hearing them. I think this discussion makes this evidence of who is trying to include who. I think we need to have more equitative discussions, and we need to start to practice that and discussing that in and also the massive media is privileged by the law, and that massive media is more like talking more and not being afraid. And we don't need to invent anything. There are a lot of people telling alternative stories in different ways. They are out there. Maybe David can talk a little more about CLACP. I would like to say, as Yásnaya said, that CLACP is the Latin American Coordinator of Indigenous Filmmaking. It was created in the 85 in Mexico. It is a reference from Latin America where we can gather and see CLACP as a court to gather our movies and recognize ourselves from our profession and with our inheritance. And going back to what we were talking about, conversations, I think that it is all about honesty and about common sense. Here's that where we think on what it's involved in including, but again, I am dictating the rules. And there are a lot of people that it's making things for a lot of years. And for people who's hearing us, the best way to collaborate or to contribute to a more fair and solidarity exchange, you need to ask yourself if you are the right person to say something. We are used to do this in the filmmaking. We do this a lot. Are you sure you have the right to tell this story? Aren't you taking the opportunity from other person to tell their own story? I think that I don't know if now, right now is the apocalypse in Christian terms, but now we know everything and we know a lot. So we need to do everything the best way we can, or the least worst in some cases. So I live here. Guillermo, do you have something to say in this issue? Well, I think as we as consumers, we need to demand materials of quality that are not only superficial issues, but also more real issues, and to demand this discussion as more equal about people that is participating in the media and the contents. So we as consumers, we have the responsibility to demand, because if we are consuming this television as current, so we need to demand much more quality. Thank you very much. We need to close. I would like to add something little. I also think that something we would like to do with community filmmaking is that you need to know that we are not doing this to compete against Hollywood, but to make an alternative to, so you can interpret us and to manage what we know how to do and how to tell, so that the people that come to look for a different knowledge or content, to give a different option to interpret us as people to belong to a different culture. We are not competing with Hollywood. That is also underestimating what are the priorities of the consumers. Consumers have the right to have their priorities, but it is important to not underestimate what you can tell to people. So talk to the people. If you want to give your back or close your eyes to what communities in the world that do, that doesn't mind that people with communities will stop cooking, singing, making clothes, or filmmakers. You're not excluding these communities. They will continue doing things. You're just opening your eyes. Thank you very much. We need to close now, but I don't know if any of you have any final reflection to finalize this topic. You want to? Well, in general, I think that we can continue talking about these issues and we can open this conversation much more, but I think that undoubtedly the most important thing is to keep ourselves open to dialogue, to listen different opinions, that many times we are not agree in the same issue, but that exactly is what diversity does. It enriches us in different ways. And I think that's why I will take home is that we need to be open to the dialogue to be better always. Very good. Yes, Naya? She went out just in the moment before finishing. Thank you, Yásnaya. Thank you, David. Thank you, Guillermo. I think this discussion, I'm sure it reached all the people and made us thinking with a lot of questions, and it make us reflect a lot of things. So thank you very much to the people who connected, and thank you to What Design Can Do for the invitation, to Ford Foundation for the support, and to If Not Us, then Who, and to the Mesoamerican Alliance of Peoples and Forests for this incredible event of urgent conversations in the Earth Day. Thank you very much. Share these reflections with more people, and I hope to see you again, not virtually, but maybe also in a virtual way. Lots of hugs to everyone.
Está silenciado. Tienes tu micrófono apagado.
Clásico, ¿verdad? Para cerrar. Felicidades, neta, primero Plaqueta, porque te la rifaste 2 eventos seguiditos, lo hiciste muy bien, y también Guillermo, David, por haber participado. Creo que fue una gran discusión.